Hey, have you been missing top-level chess? Because I know I have. The St. Louis Chess Club is organizing the Champions Showdown, which has begun today with a 3-day Chess 960, aka Fischer Random, aka 9LX tournament where Garry Kasparov is playing. If you haven't been aware of the news, well, this is your news flash. Hikaru, Magnus, Fabiano Caruana, and other top names are playing, including Alireza Firouzja. Today was day one. We had 3 matchups. The format is 20 minutes and a 10-second bonus. Let's jump into it. I'm going to try to feature as many games as possible. It is a 10-player event, so there's a lot of games. But in the first round, Garry Kasparov started out against Alireza Firouzja with the black pieces, and notice that in Chess 960, the back row is completely shuffled. So the only rule is that the king has to be between the rooks and the bishop have to be on opposite colors. So we saw Garry lash out very early, setting up like a stonewall structure like this. Openings don't matter, so if you're looking for openings advice here, the opening advice I can give you is try to take the center and play the position as much as you can in relevance to a normal structure. So we saw Alireza queenside castle early and play king b1, and Garry jumps in aggressively with the knight on c4. Both players kind of shuffled, and then Garry played this nice positional idea, counterintuitively pushing where his king is. Normally, because the king is castle on the other side, this doesn't make a lot of sense, but Garry here uses his knights to suppress the movement of white's position, but Alireza played very well. He hit the knight, made the knight go to h3, and then created this nice little pawn barrier where Garry's pieces are not so well positioned. Then Garry continued to fight in the center, but this really nice move f4, hitting the bishop and taking away the knight's escape square, prevents Garry's knight from moving, and then Alireza just looked to block up the center of the board. And actually at this point, it looked like the endgame was going to start leaning in his favor. He's got the 2 bishops, the black knight on h3 is not doing anything, but Garry demonstrated why he's all class, and he did that by simplifying the position down to an endgame, and then playing the very crucial move d4, keeping the center closed, making this trade, and another very nice move here, not scared of the bishop coming to e4, h4. A super nice idea. Now that we don't have the significance of 960 anymore, we have an endgame. He uses this idea to save his knight from danger, to break up the pawn structure that Alireza has in the center. And here, not worried about the tactic, bishop d5 check, which is a discovered attack on his king and the rook, because as it turns out, this pawn is gonna go, and the knight covers the promotion square. So the knight went from being a prisoner on h3 to an extremely vital piece in the endgame. And even if Alireza takes, you actually cannot prevent the guy from promoting, because if you play something like rook e2, I play knight f4, I hit your rook, and my pawn is coming, this pawn is coming, and it's not very good. And the game ended after hg3, rook g2. Garry brought his king up with his knight and was able to use his king, his pawn, and his knight together to get to this position where Alireza resigned, because after rook g7, king f3, knight g4 is on the way, dislodging the defender of the g-file, and it was Garry Kasparov starting off with a win in the Champions Showdown. Garry, I don't know if is back or, you know, never left is a better way of putting it. In the first round, we saw a lot of other decisive results. We saw Linier Dominguez win a really surgical endgame against Hikaru. I think, like, skipping some of the opening and getting to this position is super important, because it's queen, rook, knight, and 5 versus queen, rook, bishop, and 5. But because Hikaru has a weakness on a5 and some potential dark squared weaknesses near his king, Linier played super well. He offers a queen trade, which in this particular case benefits him because he's got the rook coming, and if you make this trade, you now have a weakness on f7, a weakness on a5, and when this knight jumps into d6, 2 more weaknesses are suddenly under threat. And in the game, we got some simplification to a knight versus bishop endgame, where one guy is going to get a much more active king than the other, resulting in the loss of a pawn for Hikaru, and all credit goes to Linier. Hikaru had said afterward in the live coverage that he felt like he should have hit the draw button earlier in the game, maybe around here, before Linier had any chances to kind of consolidate, and Hikaru failed to do so, and Linier jumped on the opportunity and simply outplayed from around this moment, really, like right when he started to consolidate his position, just when I showed it, and it was all Linier from there. He He used the king and the knight to hunt down the pawns on the queen side. These pawns are overextended. Got the pawns, and after that consolidated his position, used his extra c-pawn, and advanced. And Linier won his first game as well with the white pieces. Actually, the only person in the first round to win with the white pieces. Another big first round matchup was MVL versus Magnus Carlsen, two people who used to be ranked at the very, very top in the world in Blitz. Magnus still there, MVL falling off a little bit. Game got very spicy very quickly. Magnus castling queenside into MVL's kingside castle, and then total pandemonium breaking out. With two rooks and a queen staring down at this king, bishop b7 trying to trade off one of the main defenders, but still very solid center, I have to say. But Magnus chipping away, takes on g3, king b8, and then offers a trade of queens to get a stabilization in some capacity. Very weird structure as well. But this knight on a5 is just camping for the opportunity to jump into c4, and it was able to do that right away with the move rook c8. So we see nice play from Magnus, playing on both sides of the board. e6, nice idea as well to hit the pawn on d5. And if d6, rook g7, and we just see, like, again, Magnus trying to hit every single pawn. Nice technique. Uses the queenside expansion. MVL misjudges the sacrifice there and ends up a piece down, and Magnus is able to consolidate, not get too spooked by the passed d-pawn, and about 10 or 15 moves later, converts it into a position where he has rook and 2 versus rook. Magnus victorious in game 1 as well. But that was not it. Let's not forget who is the Fischer Random World Champion. That is Grandmaster Wesley So, originally from the Philippines and now living in the United States of America. He did defeat Magnus Carlsen in the Fischer Random World Championship. And he and Peter Svidler played f4, f5, and then Peter played queen f2. Which is weird, even in Fischer Random. The players got out to a very locked position, which is standard for Grandmasters, actually, getting a bit more of a locked position because it kind of kills your risk factor and allows you to play a bit more loosely. But actually, at this point already, the combination of the bishop defending, this bishop hitting down, and the rook and the knight, and the queen coming down to a3 potentially when this pawn disappears, leave this position completely winning for Wesley. And Wesley jumped in there with the queen, did not trade queens because trading the queens benefits the defending side. Picked up a pawn, and then despite the bishop hanging on f7, he takes the bishop on h1, circles in with his queen, his knight, his bishop, and Peter Svidler finds it very difficult here to defend his king from the impending assault of the queen and the knight, check, and queen g2, and that knight on c4, an absolute killer. And there is just nothing that could be done to stop the mate. Wesley So began the first round with a win as well. The Clash of Goats happens in the 8th minute of this video. It is the first matchup between Garry Kasparov and Magnus Carlsen basically ever. They played a game in 2004 when Magnus was a youngin' and Garry was just a few years away from retirement. So everybody's been looking forward to this matchup. Now, this is the second round, which means that the starting position is a little bit different. And if you look, these are the only two pieces not on their home squares. In fact, if you flip them, it's all good. Every other piece starts on its home square, which is sort of a bummer because it kills the originality factor in the position, and the players can play very solidly. And play very solidly they did. They actually got out to kind of a queen's gambit structure, and c5 from Magnus is already inviting a queen trade, and that's exactly what happened. And this game was honestly relatively lackluster. It has to do with the starting position, obviously, but Garry was under pressure from Magnus for the duration of the game, primarily due to this move. You say, well, Levy, what does that move have to do with anything? It's because the pawn structure is a bit overextended. Again, in endgames with symmetrical structure, you need to try to keep the balance, and it was Magnus utilizing his more active piece play to create some serious problems for Garry. And the serious problems really began right here with this break e5 and Garry counter-striking in the center with e4, simply a tactical flaw to this, because now the pawn and the rook pin, and it's incredibly difficult to defend. Magnus was basically cruising right up until this point, where he had to remove the defender of the f4 pawn, win the pawn, and convert the endgame in Magnus style. And then he spent like 7 minutes on this position. And He didn't do it. He just didn't do it. Rook f7, which allowed rook e3, and then a capture. And even though in this position the pawn structure is equal, Magnus is pressing, but not to the extent that he would have been pressing up a full pawn. But then Garry blundered right away, and I know what you're thinking. Levy, you're crazy. Gary's one of the greatest of all time. How can you be sitting here saying he blundered? It's my duty as a commentator and as a person covering the games to say it when Garry did make a mistake. Not so obvious to the naked eye why it's a mistake, but allowing Magnus to go for this pawn is not the right way to do it. And actually here, Magnus should be saving this pawn and going for this pawn. Magnus returned the favor and went for the other pawn, and there was a drawing mechanism here for Garry. He had to play king f4, chuck this pawn, and bring his king to g5. Let me tell you why. Because Magnus needs 2 pawns to win this endgame. If Magnus wins this pawn but loses b7, you cannot win the endgame. It's just going to be much easier to draw. But in the game, Garry played h4, and Magnus can win the pawn now by running the king over and then taking. So in this position, what Magnus has to do is say, to hell with this pawn, king d7. You take, I take here, and you cannot stop me from taking this pawn, and I am too close to this pawn. But Magnus, in crazy fashion, something we never see, plays king f7, and the game becomes a draw because you cannot take. Because then I will play rook h7 check and win your b7 pawn. And some moves later, the players did agree to a draw in this position. A relatively lackluster draw, I have to tell you, for a matchup so anticipated. But it is what it is. They had to obviously have this problem of the pieces in the starting position not being so easily breakable. But in the second round, we did see one decisive game, and it was Fabiano Caruana putting some pressure on MVL, and MVL making a terrible, terrible blunder right here when he took the poisoned pawn on g2. You can pause here if you'd like to figure out the winning move. It's a nice one. It has to do with the fact that that's got vision, and that is a checkmate threat that you cannot make. So how do you remove the bishop from covering the e7 square? As a beginner, you're taught never to push pawns in front of your king, and you're correct, except in some cases. It's the move b4. The move b4 is simply winning because the bishop cannot drop all the way back. You will play rook e8 with devastating intent, and if bishop a7, rook e7 is simply checkmate. In the game, MVL chucked the piece, but in this position resigned a few moves later, and Fabiano won his second round matchup against MVL. MVL actually, if you notice, is now 0 for 2. In the last round, Garry Kasparov was up against Peter Svidler. If you don't know the story about Peter Svidler and it's Hafu and Garry Kasparov, they're good friends. They know each other. And Peter put some serious pressure on Garry throughout the game, winning a few pawns and converting what seemed like a relatively effortless endgame against Garry. Trading a rook, very, very instructive moment here. Trade one rook. Don't trade both until absolutely necessary. Peter Svidler keeping his structure together, a few trades to simplify down the position, to push these 2 pawns ahead. And even though Garry does have the opposite colored bishops, he is down 2 pawns, and Svidler consolidates in a very nice way. And here, actually, Garry played king f8 and resigned. The plan is knight g3, and if h4, knight f5, using these 2 pawns, you're going to push everybody forward. And Garry resigned. Peter Svidler won in the last round matchup. A surprising guy is Lenier Dominguez. Lenier Dominguez versus Alireza Firouzja featured a baby crab opening in the final round. So b5 and g5 in the first 2 moves. The baby crab, obviously, a5, h5 would have been the big crab. And Lenier just super solid the entire game. I mean, stabilizing the position, taking pawns when they become available because he gets a nice stable endgame with the 2 passed pawns. And watch for the next few moves as he just consolidates, stabilizes on both sides of the board, make sure that his king is safe, pushes on the queen side. Pushes on the queen side, pushes on the queen side, stabilizes. Rook c2 back, b6, sacrificing a pawn at the right moment to then play rook b1 and invest fully in the pawn on b6. And here bishop f1 to again stabilize the king side, pressure and bring this bishop to this side. Now we get rook c7, takes, and simply in this position, Alireza resigned because the bishop is coming back and hitting the rook, getting it away, and it's Lenier Dominguez beating Alireza Firouzja. Alireza suffering 2 defeats on the first day, and Linné Dominguez winning against him and Hikaru. In the final round, we also saw a very strange blunder from MVL, which came right around the middle game against Hikaru, right here. Hikaru plays this nice move, bishop and queen pressuring this diagonal, so he's going for the knight. Already some trouble here for MVL. MVL plays e4, and this is a blunder. You can look here to try to find the tactic for Hikaru. Pause if you'd like. e4. I'll give you a few seconds, and it's actually the fact that you can just take. The point is that if they recapture, you want to take this bishop, you cannot because the knight is defending it, so you take the knight. And opposite colored bishops favor the attacking side. What does that mean? This bishop is out of the game, this bishop is down here, so where do you put this bishop? d4 or e5, and in the future go for the f2 pawn. That's exactly what Hikaru did. He brought his queen, he sacrificed the pawn on a7, and invested fully in getting the queen out, pressure on f2, and just a few moves later, as long as the king is safe and stable, it was in this position that MVL resigned, because there's just no convenient way to defend. If you play rook queen e1, I actually just go here. Go what? Yeah, c2. You take my queen, tough cookies. Your bishop cannot defend, and the rook is covered. The rook is absolutely covered on this file, and this position is completely lost, and it was Hikaru winning his first game of the day, and MVL suffering his third defeat. In the words of Charles Barkley, I got as many points as MVL did today. And I don't know what's going on with MVL, but he starts the first day 0 for 3. Unfortunate for him, he's got to look to bounce back, especially because the candidates have resumed. He needs to find his form. He has a few months to do so. I know it's Fischer Random. And the final game of the day that I have for you is the game between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. This is a rematch of the World Championship match, of course, from 2018. A weird game, a very weird game, which Move 20 already featured like a super locked structure with no pawn trades. But here we saw Magnus just demonstrating why he's the best. A quick trade to activate his queen, and then Fabiano began some active operations on this side of the board, but it allowed Magnus to activate his bishop and then to stabilize on the light squares. And it was Magnus who then turned the tables, saying, oh, Fabi, you really sure you want to open here with f4? King h1, rook g1, and now I'm the one who's attacking on this side. No, just kidding, g4. It's like, wait, what? But why did he play all those moves? He played all those moves because now he's got an idea to sacrifice the rook entirely. And it might look crazy, but why would you sacrifice the rook? Because your knight and bishop absolutely dominate. So he faked the counterplay to get Fabiano to overcommit on that side of the board and trade his most active piece, and then play this brilliant move h4. And after takes, it's actually Magnus again threatening g5, this, and let's not forget that pawn. Magnus finds a way to play on the king side and the queen side like it's nothing. King h2 to potentially stabilize and block this position with king h3, Magnus lingering on the queen side, and boom, in one flash, rook c1, and bringing in the bishop to cut both of these diagonals. Listen, I mean, just outstanding play. Fabi sacrifices 2 pawns and it's not enough. Magnus, dominant, uses every piece that he has, literally, like every single piece. Queen d4, and Magnus Carlsen defeats Fabiano Caruana in the final game of day number 1. I do have a scoreboard here for you, by the way. This very nice scoreboard. After the first day, it's Carlsen and Linné Dominguez with 2.5 points out of 3. Dominant performances. Fischer Random World Champion at 2, the only person. A big group of people at 1.5. And Alireza Firouzja and MVL, the 2 Frenchmen. I mean, Alireza not officially a Frenchman yet. I don't know exactly what the plan is with the federation there. But rough start for them. They look to bounce back tomorrow. Tomorrow is also a big day, because we start with Hikaru versus Magnus Carlsen, and we end with Hikaru versus Garry Kasparov. So I will be doing commentary every single day for this event, along with Anna Rudolph. If you don't know her yet, you should subscribe to her Twitch and YouTube. Subscribing to Twitch is paid, but if you'd like to, you can go ahead and do that. Links will be in the description. 2 more videos will appear on that side. Hope you're enjoying the recaps as always. And yeah, we'll be doing this every day. Catch you tomorrow.